And we welcome you into a developing story talking about the Supreme Court, a big ruling today in favor of the Obama administration on the Affordable Care Act. The Supreme Court deciding upholding these individual tax subsidies. Also, of course, a lead on Newsmax.com right now. Obamacare first signed into law by President Obama back on March 21st, 2010, the most significant overhaul of health care since the passage of Medicare and Medicaid back in 1965. Part of the issue here was the requirement for insurance companies to provide these same rates regardless of pre-existing conditions. Back on June 28th of 2012, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the individual mandate. That was another controversial decision, and today we have another one. Let's bring in Nick Tate right now, who is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Obamacare Survival Guide, one of the foremost experts on the law itself, maybe outside of Washington, D.C., but he's our local expert. And Nick, we've been talking about these two Supreme Court cases, or the likelihood of the issues that would come up ever since the law was first passed. I want to take a quick moment and just read the conclusion here of the majority opinion coming from John Roberts, citing Marbury versus Madison, which really established the process of judicial review. Roberts goes on to write that Congress passed the Affordable Care Act to improve health insurance markets, not to destroy them. If at all possible, we must interpret the act in a way that is consistent with the former and avoids the latter. Section 36B, which is the issue in question, these tax subsidies under state exchanges or federal exchanges. Issue 36B can fairly be read consistent with what we see as Congress's plan, and that is the reason we adopt. So now what?
Well, now what I think we have to watch for is what the Republicans will do. The pressure really is now on the GOP to come up with an alternative to Obamacare. This is a huge victory for the White House and for Obamacare proponents. So the question is, will we get some other reforms that Republicans can hold up heading into the presidential election 2016 and say, this is a better alternative? We've had a 5-year experiment involving Obamacare. Despite the Supreme Court's decision today, there are clear and present problems with Obamacare that even the Democrats will acknowledge. So the question is whether this ends the debate on Obamacare or whether it kicks off a new round of debates. I think it's going to be the latter.
Well, many experts on the issue said this was the most significant legal challenge or barrier in the way of Obamacare becoming even more rooted in our everyday lives. Let's read a quick little excerpt here from the dissenting opinion written by Justice Scalia in a manner in which you might expect from Justice Scalia, and we'll get to that in a second. But today's opinion changes the usual rules of statutory interpretation for the sake of the Affordable Care Act. He goes on to say that we should start calling this law now SCOTUS care. Very clever there. But the court's two decisions talking about the individual mandate on the act will surely be remembered through the years. The somersaults of statutory interpretation they have performed. Penalty means tax. Further, Medicaid payments to the state means only incremental Medicaid payments to the states. Established by the state does not mean established by the state. It will be cited by litigants endlessly to the confusion of honest jurisprudence.
Well, what Scalia is saying there is that what the court has done is they've interpreted what was in the minds of Congress when they passed this law, not necessarily what was written in the law, which is interesting. But the point that Roberts and the majority are saying is that, look, the court is confined. They can only rule on the legality. They are not in a position to set policy, to pass legislation. So now if there's an ambiguity in the law, which is what has been concluded by the majority, SCOTUS, now it goes back to Congress. If there's an ambiguity, in essence, the majority of the court is saying, we're putting the onus back on you guys. If you think there's a problem, you got to fix it. And Scalia is just arguing that that's nonsense.
Well, we'll see what happens. I mean, we have some video compiled here. We know John Boehner does not like Obamacare. The ball's now in his court. Let's take a listen to some of the things that Speaker Boehner has said about Obamacare on multiple occasions.
Obamacare is bad for America.
It's like a wet blanket over our economy. It's a government-centered healthcare delivery system.
We're going to do everything we can to make sure that it never happens.
What the hell is this, a joke?
Well, maybe the joke's on Speaker Boehner now. We've talked a lot about the GOP's necessity here to come up with some sort of alternative. Should the Supreme Court rule the other way, those bridge plans are not going to be rolled out now, but incrementally Congress has still been doing things, passing that repeal of the Medicare or the medical device tax. But yet it still has been difficult for sort of like a contract with America to emerge on health care like we saw with Newt Gingrich. But there needs to be an alternative now more so than ever. Would you agree?
I would agree, and in fact, there has been, as you say, there have been a lot of minor tweaks and piecemeal pieces of legislation that have rolled out on things like the medical device manufacturing tax, questions about Medicaid and how that should be funded, Medicare, the Medicare fix rule, which plays into this a little bit, the doc fix law. There have been some subtle changes along the way in terms of what is required of employers that have come from Congress and the White House, but there hasn't been what I would describe as a kind of majority Republican support for a specific plan. What's needed, I think, is a single page, 10-point, these are the things that we would propose. The closest we've seen to that is a law that was, legislation that was introduced last year called the CARE Act as an alternative to Obamacare in the Senate by Senate Republicans. And interestingly, that law, I think, is likely, that legislation is likely to get some premium and will become the focus as we head into the presidential campaign of whether it's a better alternative to Obamacare. It preserves some of the things in Obamacare that people like, including the subsidies. It funds them a little differently and at lower levels. And it'll make sure that people who have pre-existing conditions can continue to get insurance, allows parents to keep their kids on their insurance until the age of 26, and preserves all the sweeteners that were folded into Medicare for seniors that were cost-saving and beneficial, but it bounces things like the individual mandate and the employer mandate. So the question is, will the majority in both branches of Congress, the Republicans, get behind something that is that plan that we can really start to talk about and compare and contrast and put before the American people and say, this is our plan?
Well, let's take a listen. Paul Ryan, of course, has been talking about this. He has recently discussed the House version of a backup plan. Let's take a listen.
Do you have a plan that would make sure that, for instance, here, 16 million Americans who didn't have health insurance will get health insurance?
So, yes, we will. We want to see what the ruling is specifically so that we can customize our response to the actual ruling.
So now, again, the ball is in their court. Let's see what happens today. But does it make it more difficult now because this law has been essentially upheld twice by the U.S. Supreme Court?
In some ways, yes. I mean, the Supreme Court has basically said twice now, we're not going to kill this thing. 50-some times Republicans have passed legislation to repeal the act. They've gone nowhere in the Senate, and the president has threatened to veto those. And now this strengthens the president's position and the Democrats' position to say, there's nothing, we don't need a plan B. So Republicans really need to step up and say, this is our plan B, and it's better than plan A, than Obamacare. Let's not forget, though, that, and this is the next thing I think to watch for, and this is what the Republican candidates for president have to say about this today, tomorrow, and the next day. What we hear from those individuals will likely cast how that debate will unfold in the next year. Yeah,
it's a difficult spot for congressional Republicans because they don't want to get out in front of the presidential candidate because there will be a lot of onus on the nominee from the GOP to really present the GOP care alternative to Obamacare. But just to recap for you, the Supreme Court today ruling that those subsidies set up under the federal exchanges for states that did not establish their own health care exchanges underneath the Affordable Care Act are legitimate. So those folks will be able to keep those. At one point we were talking about anywhere between 6 to 11 million people who would be affected by this, but those folks will keep their subsidies. No word yet on what it will do to the overall cost of health care under Obamacare, because we've seen that rise as well. But stay with us here at Newsmax TV today. We'll be having a live report, more on this coming up at noon on Newsmax Now and throughout the day on our other shows, Midpoint, Hardline, Prime, and Steve Malzberg's show, and The Daily Wrap. Also, of course, you can always stay tuned to Newsmax.com for the very latest. Some great folks working on some special content for the webpage as well. For now, I'm John Bachman. Please do stay with us. We'll be with you the rest of the day.